Hey there guys, it's me Chase, and I want to do a video here. Hopefully it won't be too long, because I want to go eat lunch. And as you can see, I've already started snacking. Excuse me. A video on something that I've been thinking about a lot lately. What is the attraction to communism? Why, and particularly, why are the youth typically attracted to communism? What's the attraction to it? Because, you know, for those of us who think like we can see, I clearly think not big fans. So we would look at that and go, what are you guys thinking? I thought you guys were for freedom and liberty, right? Why would you be for communism? So it's kind of the general setup here. I think, especially in regards to, you know, the Steven Crowder, Ben Shapiro, and Daily Wire mess. It's an absolute mess. The whole thing. I think one of the things that's constantly being missed by both sides is attempting to understand where the other side's coming from. So a failure to do that results in more tribalism and more just hand grenades throwing left and right, and just war and war and war. It really is the start of war itself. I mean, even you look in the Bible, you know, like Esau and Jacob, which I just read, you know, instead of Jacob, you know, trying to fix issues, he runs away from them, and it just doesn't really help. And, you know, so that's one example. But so much of the problems in the world and the wars have started because people had these thoughts and these people had these thoughts, and instead of going, you know, hey, let's try to understand each other and where we're coming from, we just try to blow each other up and say this, that, and the other thing. You know, like the Russia thing too with Ukraine. This whole situation could be resolved if we decided, okay, what is Russia's concern? And if we really try to think about that. But we don't want to do that, because if we do that, well, then you're just sympathizing with Russia, who's just a tyrannical, horrible person, and you're a commie sympathizer, and blah 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 blah. That's, again, it's creating these sides, these tribes, that creates the real problem. And like, you know, the Crusaders didn't really make Christianity look good with the way that Crusades eventually carried on. Not great. So, you know, going so on and so on and so on and so on. But so what needs to happen is, what's very important for us is to understand the mindset of others, so that we can better address these things and maybe come to more peaceful solutions rather than throwing hand grenades at each other, as it were. So what I want to do here is I want to really try to explain the attraction to communism for my fellow conservatives to understand, and so that you can have a more intelligent conversation, because young people aren't dumb, they're not stupid. At the same time, they quite naive, and just simply don't want to take the time to really do a real thorough historical study, as well as sit down and really think about things. We don't really do that anymore, especially kids these days. We're always just on TikTok and Instagram getting our dopamine hits, and at the same time shrinking our attention span and our ability to focus on any one thing for a good long period of time. You know, everybody's getting diagnosed with ADHD, cannot simply carry a thought for more than 2-3 minutes. I struggle with that. It's really an important element of being human, and being an intelligent person, is being able to do that. Can you do it? It's an interesting thought to think about it. So hopefully, you know, we can demonstrate that here in this video, if you can follow along. If we were able to really sit down with our young youth who are attracted to communism and be able to explain exactly, not simply explain our problems with it, but explain their own attraction to it, and be able to identify the issue, maybe, just maybe, you'll get an ear that they'll want to listen to this, you know. If you just kind of go, communism is just blah, 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 you just take shots at it like that, they're just going to look at you as just, okay, boomer, and, you know, that you're not identifying with it. You're not trying to really take them seriously, and they want to be taken seriously. So that's why something like this video exists. That's why I'm making this. So the first thing I think is important to recognize, again, we always have to go back to origins, the origins of things, okay, how things started. So we think, you know, here, you know, how did we get to this point, you know? And if you think things like, you know, why is it all of a sudden that kids these days are attracted to communism? You haven't been paying attention. It's been attractive to youth for decades. A lot of youth grow out of it eventually, but it's been attractive for decades. It's been all the way back to the 60s and 70s during the middle of the Cold War and stuff like that. But again, the question is why? Why would they be attracted to this? Because it's not freedom, right? It doesn't lead to freedom. Again, it's important to understand it from their perspective. They think it is. Well, now, why do they think it is? Again, that's why we have to go back in time. And the way I would start with just basically saying is that you can go back into Israel's time. Israel doesn't just wake up one morning and decide, you know what, I don't really feel like worshiping Yahweh today. I'm just going to go worship Baal or something like that, you know, Molech, or whatever. That's not how it works. What happens is just simply traditions. Everybody's got traditions. You got traditions, I got traditions. Traditions in themselves aren't bad. Jesus didn't say, you know, didn't reject the concept of traditions in themselves. There's tons of traditions in the Bible, but they're biblical traditions, and they have a purpose and a reason for them, and we are to do them for those purposes. The Passover, or not the Passover, the Lord's Supper is a tradition. It's a biblical tradition that Christians are commanded to do. Now, what's the purpose of them? The purpose of that commandment is what Jesus says, you know, take this in remembrance of me. In other words, the Passover, or I keep saying Passover, the Lord's Supper is designed by our Lord to illustrate the inauguration of the new covenant, that we have passed from the old into the new, and that we are no longer looking ahead to when God was going to inaugurate the covenant. We're looking back to when he did. So that's what Christians do now. That's what God's people do now. God's covenant people is, in the old covenant we were looking ahead to the coming Messiah. We're looking back to when he came. And we're also, in another sense, looking ahead to when he's coming again. That's what Paul says. You're proclaiming the Lord's death until he comes. So these traditions are extremely important for those particular purposes. Now, what happens is over time the traditions they're continued on, but they're not. They don't do them anymore simply because of those reasons I just told you, for those religious, theological, deep, meaningful purposes. They're no longer carried on for that. It's just kind of carried on for the sake of the tradition itself. What ends up happening then is the tradition becomes hollowed out. It's hard for me to say, hollowed out. It becomes hollowed out. And then the tradition just becomes tradition for the sake of tradition. What happens after that, future generations, is they just start to dwindle from that. They become less interesting to them. They don't know why they're doing this. They're just told they're supposed to do this, but they're not taught why and the importance of these things. And eventually Israel just forgets them. They start to think, they start to look at these traditions, have a less high regard for the traditions themselves. And just they'll start just doing them just to do them, and then they'll go off do their own thing. And then pretty soon, future generations after that just go, why do we even do this anymore? Why do we even need to do this? Just go do our own thing. Let's just go worship Baal. Let's just go worship Molech. That blah, 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 Well, the same thing happens in America, has happened in America, and in history itself, Western history, is the traditions that the church has built become hollowed out. And the same process happens. It takes generations for this to happen. But as it hollows out, future generations begin to question those traditions. And then generations after that, or a generation even after that, begin to just basically reject the traditions and see there's no purpose in them, no meaning in them, no significance of them to that generation. And so that's basically what's happened over the last couple of decades, is the traditions in the church have become hollow and basically dead. So that future generations, again, think about why, again, ask the question, and maybe this is a good question for you to ask your own kids. Why do we partake in the Lord's Supper? How many of those kids how many of our kids who partake in the Lord's Supper really think about why they do it? Even if they're even qualified to. There are qualifications for taking the Lord's Supper. It's for believers, not for unbelievers. So why do we do it? What's the point? What's this doing? Aren't I already just saved by believing? So then why do I got to do this? Why do I need to do this? How many of our kids can really answer that question? Now, I've already given you the answer, but how many of our kids can really answer, like they know the answer themselves without someone like me telling them? Most kids, the vast majority of them, have no idea why. They just go to church because mom and dad said so, and we're just doing this thing. And mom and dad themselves don't even know why, because they're part of the generation that has come in after the hollowing out of the tradition. So that pastor who's doing all that stuff, he's just doing it because this is just what we do. This is because the Bible says. Now that's true, because the Bible says, but again, go further into depth. Why does the Bible command this? What's the point of it? What's the purpose? What's it telling you? And what are you doing when you partake of it? We should not have mediocre views of the Lord's Supper. It should be treated as a holy sacrament. Yes, I like using that terminology. I think it's good for all of us. All right, so it becomes hollowed out. Generations begin to reject it. But also their education, their particular education, public education. It was never part of the original founding of this nation. It became part of it later on, through basically socialists. Which is quite shocking to know. Did you know that? It was socialists who created public education in America. Government-funded schools, as it were. Why would the government? Now here's the thing. Why would the government create schools that would then make you question the government? They're not going to do that. Why would they do that? That's silly. They're going to make schools that are basically designed to very slowly cook the frog. And as over time, begin to develop youth who, I have a book called The Messianic Character of American Education by R.J. Rush Jr. He goes through the history of the American education system, the men who founded it, and their philosophy, how they saw things. And basically the idea that's been demonstrated is what the American education system teaches youth is to not see themselves in God's world, but to see themselves in the state and their duty to the state. And as time has gone on, what this has formulated, and it can be really illustrated. I heard this on a podcast the other day of some lady in politics who basically said, my faith influences my personal decisions. It cannot influence my public decisions. In other words, this is a result of what public education does. All those people in Washington, they're all public, the vast majority of them, publicly educated, and I would gander anyway that's true. But they're taught, as are all of us, that our religion's over here, our everything else is over here. They're separated from each other. And so if I go into government, my religion cannot have an effect on my decisions. Even in the public arena, my faith cannot influence how I act. And this effectively makes most Christians ineffective in America today. Just think, I can't do that, because they don't believe in Jesus, so I can't, I can't just talk about Jesus like that, right? Just think that, it's intruding on somebody else and their faith. It has created the exact state that the state wants. And so that's one of the issues. So you might think, well, Chase, where are you going with all this? We're talking about separation of church and state. There is a purpose for all this. When this begins to happen, when the youth coming up sees the world like this, with this sort of dualism, as it were, of the church or the religion over here and the state life over here, government issues and what public life, over here, and they're never to be intertwined. In other words, what is happening is the idea that God doesn't belong in state affairs. So what is rightfully God's, as the Bible says, God establishes these authorities, right? What is rightfully his right, and Jesus' right to own all the nations, it's been stripped. And this is done because of what's taught in schools and taught in churches. So the youth thinks, they begin to believe, they grow up believing that in order to have individual liberty, religion cannot interfere, because they see religion, they're again, because of public education, they just lump religion, it's an institution, the government's an institution, all the stuff's an institution, it's all just the same basic thing, and it's all meant to control people. And my church, at least, or the way I was raised, is that we're not supposed to be Pharisees and try to control people and blah blah blah. So to have this super libertine perspective, that's what they're taught. But no one can really live, of course, with total chaos and no laws at all. So who's going to take up the role that you've just vacated God from? The government. And so what happens is the youth is taught, and they're raised to see the government as having the ability to fill in that spot where they just kicked God out of. And make the government the arbiter of what's right and what's wrong, and to become the catalyst for making things right in the world, because God can't do it, because we've already decided that God's not allowed to do that. Well, again, somebody's gonna have to. So who does it? The government, the state, as it were. The state then begins to show itself to be much more friendly to our government educated, state educated little pawns. And so as this begins to happen, well, here comes communism, right? That's the whole idea of communism. Marx's idea, the proletariat versus the bourgeoisie, and Marx's idea, and this happens to Marx. This is exactly what happened to Marx. So Marx was raised in a religious family, but again, by that time, it's very obvious that Marx, his dad, wasn't a very good religious man. He converts to Lutheranism because it's convenient for him culturally, and this perpetuates Marx's disillusionment from religion, and that he sees religion as just simply another economic institution that the elites, the bourgeoisie, controls in order to control people. This has an effect on Marx when he's young, and that's how he sees it. Now, was he correct? Was it correct? This is one of the important points. Was Marx correct in his analysis that my dad is not a very good religious figure? Yes. But see, this is what I was talking about with the naivete of youth. And I was a kid once, so I know what this is like. Kids who are smart, they can recognize a problem when they see it. Problem is that when they see on the right, and this is my right, even though you're watching the video, it's on your left, but this is my right, they see an error on the right, as it were, here. And so they want to correct. But what they do is they overcorrect. And they fly off over into the extreme on the other end, not realizing that that's what they've done. The history of heresies in the church has done this. You know, the answer to Nestorianism was Eutychianism, which went from seeing Christ, you know, well, let's not get too complicated in that, but the Trinity, you know, the Sabellianism crisis. You know, Sabellius is focused on the oneness of God. He ends up in modalism, which is a heresy. Now, there's an attempt by Arius to correct that, but that flies off into too much correction, and he ends up separating Christ from God as beings themselves. And there you have Arianism. So it's very easy. We have to be careful that, so the proper answer to Marx's dilemma is to realize, you know, my dad wasn't a very good religious person, but that doesn't mean religion in and of itself is bad. It just means that his view and his take on it was not good. That's not what Marx does. He just throws it all. He just throws the baby out with the bathwater, and blah, he just lumps it all into one big category: the bourgeoisie, its means to control the proletariat, the masses. And so Marx, with this concept, sets out to try and design and develop a system that will remove the bourgeoisie control and class system, to destroy a class system. Because again, to Marx, the bourgeoisie creates these artificial class systems to control the masses, so that the masses must work and work and work and conk the machines, as it were, of industry. He lived during the industrial age and stuff like that. They do all this not to really work for their own things, but to make sure that the bourgeoisie continues to live in its, so the selected elite, as it were, is able to live comfortably in their little lives while they oppress the rest of them, make everybody else, enslave everybody else to their own will. That's the way Marx sees it. Now again, let's ask the question, was there truth to that? Yeah, there's truth to that. There is absolutely truth to that. But again, the problem is he saw the truth of that, and he overcorrected, and he winds up in the bad place. The real answer to this is why I was talking about the tradition part. The real answer is to go back to what the traditions tell us and to reinterpret those. But Marx just decides they're all just bad because these people claim to be religious people, and so therefore, you know, it's tainted in a certain sense religion. Again, going back to the Crusades thing, people think, well, a lot of people's rejection to Christianity is the Crusades, and don't recognize the actual history behind those, whether those were actually justified or anything like that. They just throw the baby out with the bathwater and just throw all religion into the same category. There's a bunch of nuances with all that stuff. There's a lot of history around the Crusades, but they just throw it all, and they just lump it all together, just throw it all out. And that's not how you're supposed to handle these issues. We have to think long and hard. Man, it's getting warm here. Probably because the sun is starting to come up over there, and it's getting the afternoon time, so the sun goes down that way and starts to beam into the windows. But so that's what happens, and that's what Marx did. Marx decides to create what we call communism. The idea of communism is the community. So the idea is Marx wants to remove the bourgeoisie, and instead of the bourgeoisie owning the means to production, the means of production would be shared by the proletariat, everybody. He wants to remove the class system so that there is no more control over, you know, who gets to be in this class, or blah, 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 blah. Everybody's on equal playing field. That's Marx's idea. And in Marx's world, in Marx's mindset, that equals freedom. Now there's problems. Here's the problem with all that stuff. And the problem that can be illustrated, all you gotta do is just look at the history of communism. That's all you gotta do. Not that hard. Everybody goes, well, let's go watch some real communism. No. All right. I'm sorry. That's the point where you can just tell our young friends, look, all due respect, how much of Marx have you actually read? How much of his history have you actually, how much of communism have you actually studied? That was communism. Now, maybe Marx might go, that's not what I had in mind, but the problem is here, and this is the problem I'm going to get into, the thing that Marx misunderstands, again, because he threw out religion. One of the important elements that religion, and particularly Orthodox Christianity, teaches us is that man is not basically good. We're sinners. And in Marx, because he threw out religion, rejected that. Just ignored that concept. Didn't even put it into the equation of his, when he's developing his communistic worldview. Doesn't even entertain the thought at all. He just assumes man is basically good, and on that assumption thinks that if you just remove the bourgeoisie, the class system, and you make everybody equal by use of the state, so that everybody owns everything, as it were, which of course the problem is, if everybody owns everything, nobody actually owns anything. And basically put everything in the position of the state to govern these things, not the bourgeoisie, because he thought it was the bourgeoisie running things, and that if the bourgeoisie was removed by the state, make everybody equal. Everybody's equal, everybody's paid equally, no matter what you're doing, you're all paid equally. There's nobody who gets an advantage over the other, or in any way, shape, or form. And this removes competition from the market, which is good for a flourishing society. Competition makes us be better. You know, like when I play chess, you typically want to play with a challenge, because when you're challenged, that is, there's competition, it forces you to have to be better and become better and better and better and better. That's one of the beauties of the free market system. Capitalism does, is it forces everybody to have to do better. It forces competition. That's what I love about private education, not public education. If it's public education, government has no incentive to do better in their teaching, because you're going to pay for it no matter what, because it's government funded, it's taxpayer funded, which is you, taxpayer, you're paying for it whether they do a good job or not. But if it's privately funded, then the institutions, those education institutions, are now beholden to you, because you pay them, and you can stop paying them whenever you want and decide to take your kids out of it. So their revenue depends. It's the same thing with any other business. Where I work in my dad's auto detailing shop, it's the same exact thing. We're the best in San Antonio, and not just saying that, but we are the best because we understand our competition, and we want to be better than our competition. So we're always a step ahead of everybody. That's what that competition does. And customers pay to have their cars. They pay a lot of money to have their cars look really nice and in great condition. It's capitalism. That's the whole idea of free markets. If we don't do a good job, we don't get paid. And the better jobs we do, the more revenue we take in, the richer we become. And then the more rich we become, the more we can afford things, and then we can maybe even start our own businesses. I can start my own business, and then I can hire employees and get them started on their journey. That's the whole point of the market system, the free market system. That's what capitalism is all about. It actually raises the standards of everybody, because everybody benefits. Anyways, in communism, that's all removed because of Marx's belief in the bourgeoisie. See, Marx confuses capitalism with corporatism. Corporatism is what's bad. Corporatism is when the government is in bed with corporations, and especially during the industrial age, that became much more and more of a possibility, with the ability to create massive, to produce on a massive scale, because of all the machines that were being made. It industrialized everything. People don't recognize, don't typically understand that the industrial age changed the world, and it's fairly new in history. There was a time where none of that stuff existed. You had to have your own farm, your own home, and sell your own goods in the market area. You know, like the center of town, as it were, was there to trade mostly. And nowadays, it's like meat stores and supermarkets and stuff like that. Fairly new in history. The ability to mass produce, and with all the machines that we have, this allows for the creation of corporations to control a much bigger size of industry for more profits. This is all very basic stuff, but and I'm no economic major or anything like that. Don't misunderstand me here. But with all this stuff, there is that possibility of corporatism, and corporatism is gaining favor with the government. It's essentially gaining favor with the government. Corporations getting involved in the government to make things, even to give them an unfair advantage in the marketplace. That's corporatism. That's not capitalism. And so in Marx, though, again, he just lumps it all together. Just it's all the same thing. Who cares? You know, blah blah blah. It's all bad. And so that's the reason for the development of communism in Marx's view. So I say all this because I was talking with my mom about this about a week or so ago, and she was just like, I just don't understand like, how did Marx think that by controlling everybody he was going to free them? I kind of chuckled a little bit. Well, so the thing is, Mom, you have to understand it from Marx's view. In Marx's view, he saw what he was doing as freeing people from this enemy, the bourgeoisie. That's how he saw it. Does that mean that Marx was right? No. Good intentions do not equal good results. He may have had good intentions, but he wasn't thinking through a lot of these elements. Like I was just telling you, the idea that man is basically good, and that if you remove a lot of, what capitalism offers, destroy the class system, destroy ownership of everything, and that basically make everybody own it, which means nobody owns it. The state owns it, and they just give it to you, and they decide what is needed and what isn't needed, and blah 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 blah. He doesn't see that. He doesn't foresee that. He doesn't foresee the problem with that, because he just thought, well, if we just remove the bourgeoisie with the state, the government, which is job is to protect us, then they're going to do that. They're going to protect us. They're going to be all nice and halo rings over the head. They're not going to lie to us about anything, or blah 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 blah. And of course, then what you get in the 19th and 20th century is especially in the 20th century, the rise of communism, and you can see the results. The state controls everything, and I know a lot of these kids are going to go, "That's not communism. That is communism. It's the result of communism. The idea. That's what the whole point of the name, community." The community comes first, not the individual, because Marx thought that if you just too much emphasize that one individual, he becomes a bourgeoisie. Instead, we have to go in favor of the community and remove everything, every incentive for anybody to get to the very top. And ironically, his desire to create more individuality actually leads to more the destruction of the individuality for I don't want to use the word tyranny, but the control of the state. The individual, in reality, that what it leads to is the individual loses their individuality for the sake of the state. And that's what you had going on with the COVID stuff. It's for the good of the community, right? That we have to lock down. It's for the good of everybody. That's all communism, guys. That's what it is. At the end of the day, that's what it is. So that's the attraction, is the youth sees. It starts with the hollowing out of traditions, and then the rejection of traditions, not because they're actually flawed and they're problematic, but because of the way they were taught about these traditions weakens the traditions in their minds, and then they eventually just reject them. And so they begin to see that God has less and less of a role to play in civilized structure, the structure of society. And that can go off in multiple different directions, but for our particular purpose, a lot of these kids end up in communism because they've seen the role of God's been vacated by bad theology and bad churches, and it all goes back to the church. It really does. It goes back to the church, and then in its place is filled this what we call communism. Some justice has to be done, right? Because God's not going to be able to do it anymore. We can't rely on this anymore, so we got to do it. And then you weaponize the state to try and do it. And that's ultimately what happens. That's how it happens. It's the hollowing out of tradition and the eventual rejection of tradition. And when you reject the tradition, something has to fill the place that God has vacated, as it were. Now, I'm not saying he actually has. I'm just saying for the sake of the point here being made. And then, so what fills that? If the gospel, which preaches that regeneration, through regeneration, men are made new and made better, and therefore creating better societies. When you remove that important doctrine of regeneration by the preaching of the gospel, well then, how else are you going to tame the sinfulness of man? Through the state. And that's going to create more chaos before it leads to anything good. And here we are where we are today. ultimately. Again, very simplified version of it. There's a lot more nuance and details that would have to go through, but I don't have time to go through that here. I've gone on long enough here. But that's a basic rundown of the attraction to communism. And I think it's, again, I'm just saying, that's important for us to understand. When we try to explain these things to kids and stuff these days, just like trying to get them to understand, here's the problem, the real problem here. And I understand your concerns for society and for justice, but the way you're going about it is problematic. And in fact, when you really think about it, capitalism, as I was telling my sister, when you really think about it, capitalism is the greatest check on human depravity. Because when you're living in a society in which everybody has to be better and do better, in other words, everybody's held accountable to the work that they do, which is actually what capitalism does, not what is thought of to be doing. When you're actually held accountable, it forces you to have to be better. And that's better for everybody. When you're actually, on the contrary, when you go the communist route, you don't really have to be better. You're going to still make money, and then the state's going to control things. You just left a wide vacuum. Who's, again, sinful man is like, the state controls everything. I want that. And the worst, absolute power attracts the worst humanity has to offer. When you accumulate absolute power, as communism does, into the state that controls everything, you will attract the worst humanity has to offer. You just will, because we are not basically good. We are sinners. We don't need a revolutionized state. We need the gospel. So there you go. I had something else that was on my mind, but I lost it. But so, whatever. It is what it is. Hope this is helpful. Hope this is useful to you. Soli Deo Gloria, guys. God bless. Bye.